I want to begin again by translating an image that I've created today to stand in for the missing photographs of a work that I had documentation of at one point, but apparently now that documentation is largely missing and lost. The work that I've been discussing called Displacements. And today we'll probably turn in a different direction because the image that I created raises all kinds of expansive contextual issues in terms of the way that art is framed and the way that representations, one image, idea, object, thought can be substituted for another in various levels of representation. And so I'll probably move back and forth between the way that this image represents a particular station of displacements and things that this image itself seems to suggest. Now, this image is of an installation piece in a gallery somewhere on the coast of California in Los Angeles. The image was taken in perhaps 1981 or maybe 1982. I'm not sure. The early 80s. You can see by my hairstyle in the image. This is me. That it's clearly the early 80s. And the piece involved representations, large representations, obviously, of circles. One was made on a wall with, I don't know if you can see, but these are handprints. See, right there is a good one. I don't know if you can see that, but they're handprints. They were made with the artist's fingers and hands and paint. And then there's a circle of stone, which you won't be able to perceive as a circle, but you'll have to take my word for it, that is placed on the floor. Several concentric circles in both cases, of stone and of these handprints. So the circle for me, I'm using this particular circle to portray the image of a small plastic swimming pool that was the centerpiece for one of the stations of displacements. And this pool I had described briefly in another section of these conversations as having an electrical cord running across it that appeared to be plugged into an electrical outlet, though in fact the electrical outlet had been turned off, so there was no threat of electrical shock, even though there appeared to be. And there was a boombox attached to the electrical outlet, the electrical cord, and that boombox was actually being powered by batteries, not the electrical charge coming from the turned off outlet. And as I had suggested, this was an example of an instance in the installation in which I had constructed it as an opportunity or an invitation for someone to notice and perhaps engage by unplugging the outlet or suggesting that it was dangerous, or just wondering how people would tell each other, suggest perhaps that you might want to stay away from the water there because it looks like it's a danger, or not. And again, the photographer taking pictures of the piece, had the opportunity to document some of those responses as well. So there was a newspaper and there was a lounge chair, as if someone were sitting by the side of a pool, and there were several articles in the newspaper that I had clipped from other sources and placed that were politically relevant and personally relevant, and include one of them included the obituary of my half brother, which was which knowledge came to me that this half brother had died at the same time that the knowledge came to me that I had a half brother. So, and that was within the time frame that the piece was made. Within a few weeks or months of making the piece. So I wanted to include that. Now, this little plastic circular pool in the piece Displacements was itself a sort of translation of a pool that I had an experience in and around sometime in the early 70s, perhaps 1974. And my mother, I was raised by a single mother, and my mother had snuck my friend and I into a motel swimming pool. We weren't staying in the motel. And my friend and I were playing in the pool. I mean, she had done this because it seemed like a reasonably innocuous kind of borrowing of an activity that might be fun for the both of us. Certainly wasn't authorized. So I had thought about that in terms of some of the economic issues that I was addressing in the piece, and how people use things maybe with or without permission. I talked about the hot dogs and invitations, or when there are signs that say no and when there are not signs that say no, and whether you read those signs properly or bend your understanding of the signs in relationship to your needs. These were all questions that the piece raised in a number of different ways. So this is part of the reason why I chose this. And the other reason that I chose this is because it represented a trauma. And a lot of the issues in Displacements were about trauma. As I had mentioned again earlier, I had just been assaulted, and the assault, made me interested in how we process trauma and how long we retain it and keep it, and how past traumas are oddly and weirdly and sort of terribly relived whenever we experience a new trauma. And so, depending on how much trauma you experience, you have these concentric circles that you have to deal with, and those ripples obviously registered in the piece that I chose today and revisited and selected for this. But the circular pool already hinted at that, because in the event that it translated, the pool was not circular. The initial pool was one of those cement kidney-shaped pools that are so familiar to people who live where it's sunny and warm and people can afford those kinds of pools. So this motel pool was not a circle, and even the translation into the plastic child's pool, I think, was significant at the time that I had made the Displacements. So I was working with these ideas of abstraction as well as ideas of translation, and in my mind, in a certain sense, there's nothing more abstract than a circle, particularly because it represents this sort of ideal, and it's an expansive ideal, in many ways that relates to ideas of the mandala, of universe, of eternal return, of infinite time, of expanse, inner and outer, and all of these other issues. So, and I may have even thought of this particular art piece subconsciously or unconsciously when I placed that circular plastic pool on the concrete ground of representation, which happened to be the UCSD library, a platform of the UCSD library, the exterior platform. I may have even had this piece that I observed in LA in mind when I did that, although certainly not consciously, I wasn't aware of it, but it might have been lurking somewhere in the depths of my subconscious or unconscious. So the initial experience at that pool, and I have already said that it was another trauma, but it was a trauma in a way that one wouldn't necessarily expect. So what had happened was my friend and I were playing with the chlorine dispenser in the pool, and we were throwing it up in the air, and then we were diving into the pool as it would fall down, and we were allowing ourselves, to duck this chlorine dispenser, which was made of hard plastic. And I threw it up in the air once. We've been doing this for a while, and obviously, we had the opportunity to have an audience for this. And again, these are issues that I was dealing with in terms of spectatorship, and I don't recall anyone saying, that's dangerous, don't do that. But anyway, we were having a good time, and we were ducking into the water, and I threw this plastic chlorine dispenser into the air, and I didn't quite dive quickly enough, so it came pretty squarely down on my head, and I incurred a wound, and the way that head wounds work is that they're sort of ghastly bloody. So that combined with the the fact that I was in a pool created a sort of disturbing puddle of diluted blood, and I wasn't particularly injured. I mean seriously injured, but it looked pretty bad. And my mother, became, distraught. She was, absolutely terrified. But she didn't really know what had happened. And, as I was like emerging from the pool, she was, I don't like the word hysterical. She was, okay, let's go back to that word hysterical and explain why that I don't like that word hysterical. It has so much baggage, doesn't it? I don't even want to talk about it really, but it seems to me that it's super problematic in the way that it defines a kind of distraught and unmanageable set of anxieties and fears as being the result of belonging to the woman's body. And anyway, so let's just say distraught, this extremely distraught anxious behavior that she was demonstrating. And understandably, she had, observed her child was, injured. And so she, grabbed me and ran from motel room door to motel room door, banging on the door and saying, please, please help, and I was, at the time, I was more embarrassed than I was feeling injured. But, now, and when I made the piece, looking back on it, I had thought, why didn't anybody respond? Why didn't anyone come out? It was interesting to me for a number of reasons. And then, eventually we made our way to the motel office, and she managed to call an ambulance, and an ambulance quickly came out, and I was taken to the emergency room, and they stitched up my head, and that was, the end of it, pretty much. But I, realized later that it was traumatizing, and the reason that it was traumatizing was, a combination of the way that my mother perceived the event and reacted with fear, and the consequences of the hotel managers, threats, following, are having been exposed as, misusing the pool, and then the sort of disturbing, fact of like what it means to be on display, like what it means to be the spectacle. Being the spectacle somehow was more disturbing than the injury. The trauma of the injury was much less significant than the psychological trauma of the spectacle itself. So I wanted to deal with all of these issues, and that's why I chose, or part of the reason that I chose that particular life event to narrate, and to do so in these different ways. Now, coming back to the image today that I chose, and that idea of spectatorship and contexts of art, and this distinction between being a spectator and being a performer. The image itself that I'm looking at right now, that we're looking at right now, is interesting to me for a number of reasons. All right, now, you have two friends of mine, John and Matthew and myself, looking at a work of art. So whoever is behind the camera is in some sense documenting, right, a spectatorship of a work of art, as well as documenting in some sense, or committing to a kind of archive of memory, the presentation of this installation. And yet, and I've always thought this of this image, it's very easy to imagine the three of us in this picture, not as spectators of an artwork inside the artwork, but as performers on the stage of the art. And Matthew in particular on the right is, in this kind of like absurdist theater, very much. And I'm not sure. I'm contemplating a soliloquy, perhaps, or watching something that's presented maybe off stage. John on the left seems to be arriving, like perhaps a messenger, and has something to tell the rest of us in the scene. The assumption then is that in front of or behind the photographer is a kind of, fourth wall, or perhaps not. Perhaps the photographer is another actor in the scene. What makes it possible, I think, to regard these figures in the midst of this landscape of art as performers in a drama is the narrating subject behind the camera. We don't see him or her, but somehow we perceive that there is a thinking, viewing, subjectivity narrating these events in the way that they're being formed through the framing of the image. Awaiting in time for the right moment to see or to reveal the seeing of this seeing narration. And that, it seems to me, is what I had tried to present in three-dimensional space and time in the piece itself. That the spectators would become the actors in the real drama of the piece, which the stations were just an excuse, to draw people in, to allow them to perform whatever participatory actions they chose to perform. And I think that this idea of being the performer in the world continuously comes across, practically as well in this image as it does in whatever I created in Displacements. So obviously that's one of the reasons why I chose this particular image. Now, some of the issues that I wanted to address in creating these problems or, conversations of spectatorship versus participation, of museum space versus the space outside the museum, landscapes unmarked by frame. One of the reasons that I wanted to engage those issues was because I thought that they had, significance, not only in terms of how we perceive whether art is a function of roles that we oscillate, back and forth through between voyeur and spectator, or whether art can somehow be meaningfully creative for both, those who experience it and those who imagine it, to begin with. And by creative, I guess, I think there are two poles in creativity as well. One is play. So when one imagines, for example, that if one were to imagine this installation as a kind of happening, in the sense of like Alan Capro imagined it, then these figures in its landscape, one could imagine playing, not playing roles necessarily, but playing the way that children play in that landscape. Now, it's hard to imagine this other idea that I have for the space of creating, which is as a kind of labor of love. It's hard to imagine that these figures are performing that because they seem relatively passive in their play. But there are other instances and other examples in which participants in an art piece or in life do perform labor, sometimes individuals are invited to participate in watering a garden. Now, when you might not think of that as art, but it can be. Or individuals are invited to a protest. And you might not think of that as art, but it can be. Or individuals go out of their way to make it to a place where they can vote, even though a great deal of restrictions or obstacles are placed in their way. And that's certainly labor, that's certainly work. And you might not think of it as art, but it certainly can be. And there probably was a time in which, the work of the ritual, the work of the performance was very much tied to the survival of the community and very much perceived as a kind of work, or labor. And even though that's not necessarily represented in this image, it's something that I wanted to bring to the understanding of the piece Displacements, and it's something that I wanted to raise again in reconsidering that piece and some of its social political ramifications today. And then I wanted also to, reveal the way that there's always a presenting behind the presented. And sometimes this is invisible. Whoever took the original image, we don't have a picture of him. And so I wanted to make that invisibility visible. This is one of the things that I wanted to do when I created Displacements, was I wanted to make that narrating subject, or that one presenting the image, somehow if not visible completely, I wanted to give you the suggestion that was there. I wanted to challenge the invisibility of the apparatus. And I think that, many artists are always doing this. These images that don't exist anymore from Displacements, they could have, as I suggested before, they could have become gallery pieces in and of themselves. So what does it mean for this substitution here? So you have an art piece, but then you have these actors in the art piece, and then you have these actors in the art piece being used to represent a multiplicity of ideas, and then you have the framing of the image, And the suggestion of this presentation, and hopefully beyond that, the idea that a series of images like this, again, could be, though they won't be, right, installed as museum pieces. One could imagine this image of sunlight and this iridescent rainbow that's cast over this photograph and the hand holding it. One could imagine this framed and re-entering the gallery, even though its purpose here is to narrate, right, these concentric circles of representation that really elude the gallery space, but create a kind of dialogue with it, you know, a sort of negative dialogue. And I wanted those challenges to the space of the museum and the gallery, just like in all of my art, it's always there, this challenge. I wanted those challenges to be there in the piece that I presented as Displacements. So I wanted the world in some sense to be a displaced gallery or museum, just as the gallery or museum wants to be a displaced world. And I wanted, beyond the presentations of trauma and these momentous events in our lives, and sometimes our inability to respond, you know, like the frightened deer in the headlights. I wanted some kind of breakthrough. I wanted some kind of way of saying, you know, that we have the ability to act. And maybe the rainbow that I chose today represents that sort of ideal, that sort of liberatory possibility of action in which we overcome those fears of engaging and change and challenge the restrictions of our world, the dangers of our world, that we find the compassion necessary to fully engage it.